When you have a web application, the first two questions you're going to be asking your users are, number one, who are you? That has to do with authentication. And number two, what are you allowed to do? That has to do with authorization. ASP.NET has features for both of these. It's going to help you out. Controlled via web.config. In fact, if you look at your root web.config file, you'll see that authentication by default is set to be Windows integrated, which kind of makes sense because when you start off developing a web application, you'll usually be doing it on your own machine, and Windows authentication just works there. It's very, very simple. Authorization, there's a feature known as URL authorization that's in ASP.NET, built right in. And there's a section called authorization, which we'll be talking about in more detail later. As you can see, the root web.config file basically just lets all requests in by default. But I'll be showing you in a little bit how to tweak that. But first off, let's start off by looking at how authentication works on both IS7 and on IS6. So let's switch over to IS7 first. I have a very simple web application here. It's got one web page, default.aspx. And if you take a look at that web page, I'll show you the code for you later. But all it does is just prints out the user's name or whether they're anonymous. And it also prints out the user's the authentication type, how we authenticated the user. So it'll be a little diagnostic for us. I'm going to go ahead and bring up IS7 and drill down into our machine and find our default website. I'm going to add an application. Okay, simple web. Very similar to how you would do this in IS6. And if I find the authentication feature here in IIS and take a look at that, you'll see that anonymous authentication is enabled by default and everything else is disabled. This is kind of a misnomer. There really isn't any authentication going on. When you have anonymous, it just means that we're just going to let requests come through. We're not going to try to figure out who the user is. We won't challenge the user in any way. Let me go ahead and bring up a browser and point it to our website. Actually, it's a little easier to go from here. Just browse to it. So we browse to our application. And as you can see, we're anonymous by default. If we switch back over here and turn off anonymous and turn on Windows authentication, then you'll see that we will be authenticating users using their user account. I have a local account on this machine called administrator that I'm logged in under, the default account. The authentication type is listed as negotiate, and the reason for this is because when you do Windows integrated authentication, it's technically a negotiation between Kerberos, which is preferred, versus NTLM challenge response, the older protocol. And that's what we're using here because we're using local accounts. Now, this Windows-based authentication works great. It's the thing you want to choose if you're building an application for people who are all in a domain, or it's a small application servicing a group of people that all have Windows accounts in your system that you can authenticate. It's just a very easy way to get started. So now let's switch over and take a look at the same thing on Windows Server 2003. I have the same application. I'm going to start up IS6. Drill down in, find the default website. Going to add a new application. Simple web. Again. Okay, same path. Run scripts. We need that in order to run ASP.NET. And let's browse to the page and see. We should see the same exact thing we saw on the other site with IS7. So if we go into the properties for our application here, directory security, authentication and access control. This is where the similar features are in IS6. So I'm going to turn on integrated Windows authentication and disable anonymous access in order to force everyone to authenticate using Windows authentication, and we get the same thing.